welcome everyone. I'm Giovanna Gini, a research fellow at the Maximizing UK Adaptation to Climate Change Hub, also known as the MACC Hub. This webinar is part of an ongoing series that brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and community voices to deepen our understanding of adaptation, and particularly transformational adaptation in the UK. If you want to know more about the MACC Hub and the work we are doing, you can visit our website and also subscribe to our newsletter. Today's focus is on the question on a question central to the CCC work, but is often overlooked because of the challenge in addressing it, which is what does a well-adapted UK looks like. Unlike emission targets, adaptation lacks a clear shared vision to guide investment, align efforts, and drive ambitions. Without such a vision, adaptation risks remaining fragmented, reactive, and under-resourced, looking in greater risk and cost for the future. To guide this reflection, we are joined by four outstanding speakers who bring perspective from research, advocacy, and policy. Each will offer a short provocation of around 7 minutes, after which we will open the floor for discussions and a Q&A. I will try to be very, very strict on the time. Hopefully, we will be able to keep it 7 minutes, so we have a lot of time to also discuss. Our first speaker is Ruth Hunter. She is a professor at Queen's University of Belfast, and she will be talking on green space and community climate action. The floor is yours, Ruth.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. So I'm hoping you can hear me okay and see my slides okay. So thanks very much for the invitation to be involved. I'm primarily a public health and planetary health researcher in the Centre for Public Health at Queen's. And my research is mainly on health and environment, and a lot of that work that I've done over the last 15 years or so has focused particularly on green spaces, which I'm going to talk about today. So green space can be described as a kind of multi-solver, or having multiple wins, say from a policy perspective. And we know that green spaces, so we're thinking about greenways, parks, etc., can impact on health in a number of different ways, as shown in this diagram, including physical health, mental health, but also then thinking about a range of co-benefits, such as social well-being, different economic outcomes, and also environmental outcomes as well. But the elements at the bottom of the diagram, and the physical environment box and the environmental outcomes box, are much less well developed, and the evidence base sparser, and also thinking through what impacts these different elements have on health. And we know that these spaces can also impact on inequality. So this is just a link to a paper that we published last year that really explored the association between green space distribution, and we were particularly interested in preventable deaths, so thinking about our chronic conditions such as heart disease, cancers, type 2 diabetes, etc. And what this showed us, this was analysis across the UK, that except for Wales, there was significant inequality in the distribution of green space across the UK. And the headline finding here really was that for every 1% increase of green space in a particular geographic area, the annual count of preventable deaths among the most deprived neighbourhoods was lower by between 37 and 41%. So we know that investing in these types of green spaces in our most deprived neighbourhoods are important for public health prevention strategies, which are particularly important when we're thinking about cost of living crisis and the growing issues in the NHS. So let me talk through just one example of a green space in more detail. So as I say, I've been doing work particularly with the Connswater Community Greenway in Belfast for the last 15 years. And this is largely kind of started out as a health-focused project, evaluating the public health impact of the Connswater Community Greenway on local residents. And this slide here just highlights some of the key elements of the Greenway. So it's a 16-kilometre linear path supporting dedicated cycling and walking. There's lots of events and engagement with the local community to ensure that the space is well maintained and used in stewardship. It's open and lit 24 hours a day, which is one of the only public parks and spaces in Belfast lit and open 24 hours. But But there was also elements around climate adaptation, such as landscape and biodiversity, and also restoring the 3 concourses of the river that the Greenway runs along, and flood alleviation. But in more recent years, we've been starting to think more and more about how we can consider the Greenway in terms of supporting local communities in terms of climate adaptation. So our kind of next phase of work that we're moving into with the Greenway is very much thinking about that role, the role of the Greenway in supporting local communities, thinking particularly about things like sources of sustainable food, sustainable travel, sustainable energy, housing, and the economy. So thinking beyond flood alleviation, but also expanding that alleviation scheme around active travel schemes, also about biodiversity and that link to health, and cooling as well, where we see our increased temperatures. And we know from some of our previous research that the Greenway's had improvements in mental well-being and physical activity levels, in social capital, and also perceptions of the environment. And this is just some headline findings from a social return of investment, where we looked at the economic impacts, looking at different aspects such as property values, flood alleviation, tourism, biodiversity, climate change that was around modal shift from the car to walking and cycling, and other elements like health and well-being, crime, employment and productivity. And the headline finding here was really that for every £1 invested in the Greenway, there's about a 1.34 to 1.56 expected return, which equates to about a net present value of around 60 million. So let me just focus in on the climate adaptation elements that have been incorporated so far in the kind of design and build phase of the social return investment. So we have a £12 million flood alleviation scheme. So about just over 1,700 properties protected from flooding. There's also that 16-kilometre dedicated walking and cycling infrastructure to support that modal shift from car to active travel. And some of our figures show us that over 700 fewer cars are on the road in the Greenway area per day on average, which is about a 1% reduction. And just briefly wanted to mention the importance of messaging. So with our sustainable urban drainage schemes along the Greenway, which are very much designed to purposely flood when we have heavy rainfall. And this slide just shows an example of some of the messaging that the Greenway team do really during this time to reassure the public that this scheme is doing exactly what it is designed to do, to help and protect others from flooding in more vulnerable areas such as people's home. And I think this public communication element is really important with these types of schemes. So our next phase then, say we've been doing some community consultation work over the last couple of years in a series of workshops, and there's a link here to the report, really thinking through how the Greenway can support community climate and nature action, particularly around adaptation, but also biodiversity as well. And they came up with these 7 different recommendations. So I'll just briefly highlight things around eliminating emissions. So through the provision of safe walking and cycling routes in connection with public transport routes to promote active travel. Thinking about the Greenway neighbourhood, which has brought in new businesses and housing to the area. So there's a role here maybe in promoting energy saving initiatives, and also around energy generation, such as deployment of on-site energy generators, thinking about wind turbines, solar panels, hydroelectrics, ground source heat pumps. And also a role in carbon capture, so through wetland expansion, for example, tree planting, and also soil improvement. Again, extension of the flood alleviation scheme and building biodiversity. So let me just finish just with, we were asked for some provocations or for some questions. So some questions certainly that we're facing in this new kind of phase of work with the Greenway, and I hope will spark some discussion and would really welcome some good practice examples. So how do we measure the impacts of our interventions and policies, that these climate adaptation interventions are working, and what those health co-benefits may be? Thinking about the trade-offs, so I talked a bit about inequalities, but ensuring these are a space for everyone that have multiple uses and multiple users, and how do we create a shared space while also seeking that climate adaptation element? And how do we bring the community with us? When we first did some of our climate workshops, I think it was on our 3rd go, when we framed it around supporting local communities and removed the words of climate. So how can we bring the community with us to these conversations, that they're very much part of that discussion? So I think I'm just within time and happy to join in the discussion at the end. So Giovanna, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Ruth. And yes, super on time. And that was super interesting as well. Thank you so much. And please, if you have any questions, you can write it in the chat. And we will open the discussion at the end of the full presentation. The next speaker is Colleen Cluett from the Future Generation Commission from Wales. And she will be talking about the Welsh vision for the future and climate adapted Wales. The floor is yours, Colleen.
Great, diolch. I will also share my screen. So great. Prynawn da pawb, good afternoon. Colleen dwi. I'm Colleen. I work as a Sustainable Development Advisor in the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So when it comes to a vision for a well-adapted UK, in Wales we have something unique. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act asks us to think long-term, to put people, culture and the environment at the heart of decision-making. It's not about how adaptation fits into the existing status quo. It's about envisioning better futures and then working as individuals and collectively to achieve them. So this better future is described through Wales' 7 wellbeing goals on the screen, which were developed by and with Welsh communities. So some of you may be familiar with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but many of you likely won't be. So I'll use my time to expand on how the goals translate to a well-adapted Wales and reference the original publications. So what does a climate-adapted Wales look like if we truly live out the spirit of this act? So our natural environment is resilient, with improving biodiversity and ecosystems that have the capacity to adapt to changes and support resilience in our ecological, social and economic systems. This looks like rivers running cleaner and floodwaters being slowed before they reach our homes, peatlands and wetlands being restored to lock away carbon and give us cleaner air and water. Adaptation here is not about concrete walls, but about living landscapes that support our well-being by absorbing shocks, protecting biodiversity, and sustaining life. It is a Wales of more cohesive and equal communities where people are enabled to fulfill their potential no matter their backgrounds, and communities are attractive, safe, well-connected and viable. This requires that climate adaptation in Wales is just, recognising that climate change does not affect everyone equally, and often the people in our communities that are most vulnerable to societal and economic shocks are also those most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. A Wales adapted to climate change is one where no one is left behind. Rural and coastal communities, often the first to face climate risks, receive the support and resources they need. Urban neighbourhoods are cooled with green infrastructure, and all our places are designed for sustainable transport, which means considering our transport system not just in terms of how people get around now, but how they will in the future. Adaptation must also be rooted in our culture, language and arts. We recognise that in this land of prose and song, the Welsh language and our vibrant cultures and heritage are not side issues or nice to haves, but are of real value as we adapt our lives to our changing climatic realities. In this Wales, people are healthier, both mentally and physically. We have a preventative healthcare system that prioritises keeping people well, in addition to treating them when they're not, and that recognises that so much of our health happens outside of healthcare settings, in our homes, our workplaces, and our environment. Adaptation in Wales must go hand in hand with economic transformation. The vision of our economy in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is one that is innovative, productive and low carbon, one that uses resources efficiently and proportionately, recognising global limits. We cannot simply patch up the damages of climate change while continuing with business as usual. Instead, we embed a wellbeing economy approach. We build on our recycling successes to create a more circular economy that is less dependent on extraction and more rooted in the places where people live. We use community-owned renewable energy to power our places. People are in work that is fair and sustainable, and workers leaving high-carbon industries are supported into new roles, with fairness at the centre of this transition. Adaptation is not just about survival, it is about prosperity shared fairly across Wales. And in terms of Wales's impact on the world, a climate-adapted Wales is globally responsible. We acknowledge that our actions here, our energy choices, our consumption patterns, our political decisions have ripple effects across the globe. So we have sustainable and ethical supply chains. We end imports that damage ecosystems elsewhere, and we support climate justice internationally. So that is what these goals mean for Wales and what we want it to be like in 2050. But at the heart of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is one question: are we being good ancestors? In a climate adapted Wales, the answer must be yes. That means rejecting quick fixes that store up problems for tomorrow for our children and our grandchildren. To realise this, the Act places duties on public bodies in Wales to do all they can to achieve these goals within their remits and to work collaboratively in a place-based way to achieve even more. Crucially, none of this can be done by government and the public sector alone or by experts working in isolation. A climate-adapted Wales, as described in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, is one where people are actively involved in shaping their futures. Too often, visions of resilience and plans for how to achieve it are made without communities and the people who will be impacted by them, often away from these places entirely. In Wales, we have a national ambition, but that needs to be complemented by place-based visions and approaches that fit the opportunities and needs of our communities. This will often mean hard choices and potentially contentious decisions, so these must be made collectively, respecting democratic principles, and that conflict can contribute to healthier and more robust decision-making. What we cannot accept is treating our economic well-being as most important. The Act requires that we weigh the social, cultural, and environmental alongside the economic. It reminds us that resilience cannot come at the expense of fairness. We cannot accept decisions that work for the few but not for the many, and we cannot accept passing these costs and problems onto our children. We have to remember that adaptation should never just be technical, spreadsheets, solar panels, and sea walls. Problems solved without context of how or why they have emerged, individuals acting alone. We need to consider the root causes. We need to involve people impacted by situations and decisions, collaborate with others, think about the long-term impacts of our decisions, and act in an integrated way. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act gives us an opportunity, the legal and moral framework to create a future where adaptation is fair, inclusive, and hopeful, and a responsibility to be bold and to realise our vision for a Wales that is resilient, just, prosperous, joyful, and globally responsible for us and for the generations to come after us. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I myself have raised so many questions, but I will keep it for after all the presentation. Our next speaker is Ian Roderick from the Schumacher Institute, and he will be talking about system thinking, forest size and transition. The floor is yours, Ian.
Thank you, Johanna, and it's been great to have those two wonderful examples of what's going on. Very much to build this world that we want and create the visions of where we want to be. I'm from the Schumacher Institute for Sustainable Systems, and our mission is to promote the use of what I'm now calling complex systems foresight, which is that sort of blend of systems thinking, foresight, transitions thinking as well. I came across a quote in The Guardian a couple of days ago, which I thought was perfect. It was from the specialist in the National Emergency Supply Agency in Finland. And he says, my job at the National Emergency Supply Agency means I spend much of my time thinking about what could go wrong and how we can make Finland ready for when it does. And for me, that is the essence of the kind of work we do. It's very much about trying to understand what's going on with our systems and where we can actually improve them and make them more resilient. Just a moment, my screen isn't going forward. We're good. So systems thinking and complexity science are very much about what could go wrong with us, and what we're trying to do is develop a framework for examining the entire system and its emergent characteristics. And this is why, all the kind of work we want to do in creating a well-adapted UK requires us to think about what these systems are and how they interact, and how can we map them and look at all the sort of emergent properties that actually happen within them. So systems thinking is all about exploring these strategies for addressing the unknown and the uncertainty of things. So it's very much not about exact prediction. I'm hoping I can get my screen to go forward, but it won't. We've gone much too far forward now. Right. The next stage of basically doing this work is foresight. It's very much the importance of monitoring the environment and trying to anticipate what's going on, envisioning the future and preparing for all those scenarios that we might need to work with. This is our way to navigate the uncertainties and shape the desired outcomes that we want to see. And very much with the concept of adaptation, we actually have to acknowledge the complexity of it all and the uncertainty that we deal with. There's this whole area of thinking of transition. We can create the visions, and we've described some of those already today, what we would like to see. And we can talk about those as much as we want. We can go back and we can analyze where we are, trying to understand it and see what we can do. And then we can try to think through what we call this transition. How do we move from where we are to the vision we want to be? And then step back and look at the different steps along the way. So we have this whole area of transition science developing, which allows us to do a great deal of this. And there are obviously many methods and tools that exist around to guide these processes. This is a well-known one. I'm sure many of you know about it, the Three Horizons model for change, where we understand where we are and we want to get to a vision of a future, which is the well-adapted UK, and we actually recognise that this is going to it's going to have a difficult time getting there. There are certain things going to help it. There are many things that are going to get in the way and act as barriers and prevent us getting there. And we need to model this and try to understand the processes that are going on. On top of all this is the fact that we actually have to be very critical about the way we think and how we then take action. And this is where the whole idea of ethical approach needs to be really considered strongly. Studying the future affords power and control, influence over others. So we need to think hard about whose perspectives and preferable futures dominate, who therefore gets marginalized in these discussions about what we want in our visions. We also have to recognize that we can have self-fulfilling prophecies. What we imagine our vision can generate that future. So we have to be very careful about how we explain and talk about the visions we want to deal with. Should our research into how vulnerable our systems are, or should we stay away from this? There's strong arguments to say discovering our vulnerabilities allows people to exploit them. So should we stop actually trying to work out how vulnerable our systems are? Stirring up fear produces a reaction to deny it. So there is this problem about generating fear by our looking into the future and our visioning. And we may actually make it more difficult to overcome those. We may entrench the behavior that's created that fear. Should we conspire to affect the future? And overall, though, this is what are the ethical framings that we should adopt for this work? There's a whole range of ethics from, looking at the greatest happiness for everyone, all the way through to a very caring and pragmatic type of ethics that we should work with. So I'll finish up by saying that my vision for a well-adapted UK is one where we're using complex systems foresight at all scales, whether that is very much at the local community or at a national level or international level. We need to have transition thinking to inform our actions so that we have placed our actions into a framework there that moves us from where we are to where we want to be. I think we should always be exploring the ethical problems that come out of our thinking for adaptation. And lastly, more than anything else, a well-adapted UK for me means eternal vigilance. We've got to be always monitoring the external environment to make sure we know where we're going and what effect may be. So that's my take on well-adapted UK. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ian. And don't worry, I think that even after COVID, we're still not used to technology, and we keep on. I keep on doing also a lot of. I keep on of struggling with technology when I'm doing presentation. Our final speaker is David Gunn, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. David will discuss transition pathways and decision-making approaches that can meet the challenge of the present moment. The floor is yours, David.
Great, thank you very much, Giovanna. Thank you for inviting us, MACC. You're doing great work. It's great to be a part of the conversation, and thank you to the previous speakers. So my name is David. I run the Sustainability Accelerator at Chatham House. We're particularly interested in kind of new frontiers of thinking and action regarding the transition. And given our role, I think we're generally interested less in some of the on-the-ground work, but how the transition interacts with kind of new or existing kind of nexuses of power and governance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. In the context of a vision for the future of the UK. I'm going to talk less about solutions and sort of preferred futures and outcomes, and more about the kind of the design principles. How do we start on that path? And I think that's hopefully helpful, A, because it's an urgent need, but also just because I want to underline that adaptation is a constant process, right? We're not trying to get to one state. I think this really is about a process of adaptation that will unfold over multiple generations, in the kind of ways that Wales talk about in a very beautiful and inspiring way. Tip of the hat to Wales, always love you. So look, there's in that context, there's three things that I wanted to talk about that are kind of these design principles, and they are navigating uncertainty, which Ian flagged, and I'd like to talk about a bit more. Embracing multifunctionality, and rethinking our approach to objectives. So I'm going to talk about each of those quite quickly and hopefully get it into 7 minutes. So the first one about uncertainty. A lot of the work within Chatham House and our networks at the moment is thinking about the implications of living in the contours of a post 1.5 world. And I think that's really key for an adaptation conversation. And that is a world, yes, of increasing climate impacts and shocks, also the possibilities of significant tipping points of AMOC, subpolar gyre, and those kinds of things that really have deeply transformative impacts on our ecosystems. But importantly, it is not just about more shocks, but also growing uncertainty in being able to predict what the future might hold, both climatically, but also the kind of social and political environments in which we inhabit. And I think so, in brief, in the future that we're adapting to has a far wider range of possible futures, but also less ability to predict or analyze risks within that. That scenario causes all kinds of problems for traditional decision making that we've relied on for the last 100 years. Highly technocratic, based on a relatively stable climate and a relatively stable social and political system. And that's tended to have a whole bunch of approaches that focus on best case, least cost, just-in-time supply systems, all of those kinds of approaches, but very vulnerable to shifts in the underlying assumptions. And that the world that we are moving into is one where those assumptions are going to be less fixed. And so I think navigating uncertainty really means a different approach to what we think of as the best solutions, much less about best case, least cost, much more about being really robust to quite different possible futures that we might inhabit. And I think that means some quite deep shifts in what we think of as important. I think within the energy system, nuclear might look really attractive within one set of futures, but looks highly fragile within a set of others. So I think a set of scenarios that really are robust to more pathways is really important. I also think a plurality of approaches is really important. In the provocation from MACC, there was a question about, is it one route or are there multiple routes? In a context where we don't know what the future holds, this exploration of a diversity of approaches is, I think, a well-proven principle to hedge against possible futures. So I think this idea of plurality, important ethically, morally, socially, but also I think from the efficacy of the transition, really valuable. The second piece I wanted to talk about is embracing sort of multifunctionality. historically within the transition, we've often kind of segmented things, most obviously mitigation of climate emissions and adaptation. That has led to some really weird situations where people might be looking at like potential energy and carbon capture solutions that look great until you realize you might need part of the planet to feed people from as well. So I think we're entering into a period, and I think Giovanna mentioned transformative adaptation, I think is a key one, where actually the solutions that we deploy need to work far harder across multiple domains. I think the win-wins of mitigation adaptation within the transformative frame, really important. A lot of the nature-based solutions that Ruth was talking about at the outset, I think also really valuable. Guess what? Nature knows how to be multifunctional. So I think leaning on that element is really important. I think within that also is a rethinking of relationships. We are in a period that's going to be resource constrained with increasing competition around land. I think in that context, the relationship to land is going to change. And I think a key part of the pathway to a future Britain is thinking about that relationship to land. Part of that will be the commons types approaches that I think are gaining ground at the moment. But I also think there are new relationships between other kinds of landowners that have the potential for more custodial relationships to land. And I think part of this future vision is actually a re-articulation of the relationship between different parts of civil society, business and government around land. So that's the second piece, really, just sort of embracing multifunctionality, getting things to do more in the future. And the final bit, really, I just wanted to focus on is talking about objectives. I think for those of us who work within the climate space, you know, we've come through a 20-odd year period that's been very focused on kind of measurable outcomes. I think most obviously within net zero, but like let's get to single metrics that we can pursue. I think there's a real question about that with adaptation. Like, how do we actually quantify progress? I think it's really important. But single numbers in a world of high uncertainty are much less likely to generate desirable outcomes. Because we don't know what we don't know at the moment. So actually, like by looking on single outcomes in a similar way to net zero is likely to kind of put many of us on the wrong path. And I think that's true at a general level. I think it's also true because we all know that adaptation really is about the specifics of place, both bioregions and also kind of cultures and economies. So I think this moving away from quantifiable outcomes, I think, is really important. What sits in its place, I think, is still being debated. I think certainly within the conversations that we hold, there's increasing emphasis really on let's be clear about process and deliberative process rather than outcomes as one of the key mechanisms. And I think that's true at a community level. I think it's true at the level of being a global pension holder as well. So I think part of the vision of a future here is actually about a different kind of deliberation and a different approach to how we prioritize getting to outcomes. And so that's, I'll just close off there. I think the final thing I want to say, as someone who sits within like an international affairs and geopolitics place, I think we're at a moment where communities on the ground are ahead of governments in many instances. And I actually think one of the challenges is how these larger institutions can interface differently with all of the rich innovation that's happening on the ground. And that is a key part, I feel, of a better future for the UK. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, David. And all of the speakers, I think everyone up for different things. And somehow I think that we are kind of saying the same as well. I will open the floor to questions. I will invite the participants to write their questions in the chat. But before that, I will ask the speakers if any of you have reactions or questions between yourself. Yes.
Well, I've just a quick question, both Colleen and Ruth. Did you get much involved in collaborative discussions around the issues you're dealing with? Is that very much part of your process to involve as many people as possible in your discussions?
Yeah, I can go first on that one, Colleen, if that's okay. Yeah, yeah, I mean, a lot of our work is co-designed with local community members, local residents, and also multi-sectoral partners as well. So I think that's integral. I'd say a lot of it, even just thinking about, I think some of the other speakers touched on this as well, is how we talk about climate adaptation, how we make it really relevant to people in a hectic world and busy lives and so many other competing interests and priorities. And I think we've learned a lot in very much through our community engagement work about how we do that, and how we kind of make this graspable in some ways with local communities, but also meaningful as well. So I think that's key through all stages of this. I mentioned in my slide about bringing people with us, and it is very much about how we do that, and part of it is spending time building relationships. We're really trying to understand where this sits with where people are already at.
Great, thanks, because I think that sort of relates very much to what David was saying, was the importance of deliberative processes involved in this work.
And from the Welsh perspective, and the Act requires that public bodies involve people in the decisions that they make, and so what that looks like depends on the context, I suppose, but ideally it's more on the co-productive side of that equation, and really working to what their priorities are, and collaborating with others. So a lot of these are beyond the remit of a single local authority or a health board. So how do they work with other organizations as well, and try to achieve multiple aims? And I suppose that's, it was interesting from the talks, was the idea of, well, we're not really in one presence, and how we embrace like multiple presents and then multiple futures, and a lot of that is through deliberation, I suppose, and understanding different perspectives, and it's we don't do it perfectly, but that is the vision for it, and the ambition.
Right.
Perfect. I have a question. I don't know if we maybe it's too broad, but basically, every one of you offer a sort of solution or a pathway to a vision, right? And I'm interested in know a little bit about what do you think are the biggest barriers to the implementation or mainstreaming or massification of these strategies, but also like perhaps more than barriers, what I'm more interested in is like, what do you think are these magic moments or these magic actions that we can do to make these strategies realities and start action?
I pressed that unmute button first. So I suppose in the Welsh context, we've got the legislative requirement, but the Act came out 10 years ago. Since then, there have been multiple shocks, and as David said, we're expecting more and more shocks in the future, and that can make it really difficult for public bodies in Wales to think beyond what they have to do right now with stretched resources and to go beyond the pressing issues of the day-to-day. So I think that's often the biggest barrier, and understanding how everybody can apply this in their way and play their small part, and it really is that systems approach to it. But magic moments, I think, are when people get together. I think the Act in Wales has a huge opportunity to inspire action, and for people to really see themselves as part and to want to contribute. And I speak to people almost every day who are inspired by the Act, who've moved to Wales potentially to contribute to this, who've joined public bodies here, or in our team we have a Future Generations Leadership Academy, so it's young people under 30 who want to contribute to this. And I think that those moments of connection and understanding key opportunity or ways that we can work together to achieve it are really some of the magic ones, and having that vision is really helpful for us.
Just another a thought, Giovanna, around the sort of magic moments. I mean, I think I think we are in a moment where adaptation is like really ticking up the agenda in so many places. And I think that is the magic, like at a broad level, I think that is the magic moment, right? I think we've had a 15-20-year period that has extremely high levels of concern for climate across a really broad spectrum of the British public and globally. But the mobilization has focused on decarbonisation, and that's very, very important, but very, very hard to mobilize big groups of people around. And I think we've all experienced various blowbacks around that. I think the interesting moment we are in is that an increasingly large part of the British public is not only concerned about climate in the long term, but experiencing it right here, right now, whether that is through direct impacts or through like food prices and all of those things. So I think that this is a magic moment. Like from a positive point of view, I think we have this very interesting moment to take hold of that. But it is also a time where the tussle around it, what adaptation means is going to be much more intense than it has been. You know, we are in a period where adaptation is going to be posited really as a defense mechanism for like fossil fuel emitters to carry on doing what they do. You know, let's not worry about mitigate. You know, I think we are in that moment. So I think that in answer, and it relates a little bit to one of the questions in the chat about how do we mobilize politicians. I think we are in a moment where this adaptation conversation is getting bigger. And the job of anyone who cares about it, I think, is to make that the most expansive version of adaptation that we can, because that's what is happening on the ground, and it's what's needed at the level of a nation state as well. So I think the leaning into these much more broader and expansive versions, whether that is the work that's happening in Wales, whether it's folks like Civic Square, I think there's so many examples that are so diverse and so interesting at the moment that actually the celebration of that diversity and ambition, like that is the magic moment. Like everyone look, you know, people love people and people look to what everyone else is doing. I think we're in a moment where that reality can be constructed at scale in the UK.
I think from the work I presented, the work with the Greenway in terms of barriers, I think one of them is, you know, a lot of this work requires multiple partners, so it's trying to align those priorities of those different partners, the budgets, etc., expertise of those different partners to come together to kind of develop and implement this. The other is, you know, we're in this kind of piloting phase of, so it's how we do at pace that we kind of learn, improve and share what we are doing, that things that work well can be rolled out and others can pick up and use and implement. And the other thing I think barrier is around skills, particularly when we're thinking about, you know, management, maintenance, stewardship of these types of spaces. Here in this context, I'm, you know, thinking specifically about green space, but that's becoming a kind of bigger and bigger conversation with our local authorities, etc. Is ensuring that there's the skills base there for that management, maintenance, and stewardship of these types of schemes.
I think as just picking up on David's point there about you know, adaptation sort of taking for the foreground and mitigation maybe being put back on the back burner a little bit. It's quite interesting because you know, the debate about climate change has for a long time been focused on that long term. We talk about, you know, doing things by 2050, which is way outside most politicians' timeframes. Whereas adaptation is something that we are reacting to in today's world. You know, it's heat in the cities, you know, leading to higher mortality rates. That is today's problem, and therefore it brings that politicians' view into the here and now. So they actually have to work on that one. So I think that some of the comments in the chat there were about how we get more politicians engaged in this. Well, I think when it does come down to the fact that you're talking about 2 to 3 year time horizons rather than 20 to 30 year time horizons, that, you know, you're going to get the attention of that. And I think we ought to work more and more with trying to make sure that politicians are focused on sorting those things out. But we must not forget that mitigation has to continue, and we have to continue strongly with that kind of effort wherever we can. So it's definitely both situations we need to work with. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for those answers. I have two questions from the Q&A chat. One of them is for Colleen. Colleen, it says, Holly Smith says, Colleen, I love the Future Generation Commission work. How in practice is it used? Is it on individual projects or at a higher policy level? And a second question from David Griggs. What do the panel think is needed for the disproportionate impacts of climate change on socially vulnerable groups to become a mainstream part of how local government carry out their planning and place making?
I'll start with Holly's question quickly, if that's okay. And dear Holly, that's great. And I was actually just typing some of it. So I suppose it's designed fundamentally to be used at an organizational level. So public bodies in Wales need to establish wellbeing objectives that sit at a corporate level, and they need to maximize their contribution to the wellbeing goals. So these will be in their corporate plans, and they need to then set up steps and look to implement that. So that's the legislated purpose, but we see it used at a range of levels. So people can use it in individual projects, and we have a framework for projects that you could even use to look at. We're trying to do that in the MACC Hub work in the Welsh Spoke to really embed the Future Generations approach. But people can use it and how they make decisions, to scrutinize decisions, and how they set up policy. So we see it a lot in the Senedd that people are asked, how have you considered the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in this decision? Because it covers adaptation, but it covers so much broadly than that. So I'll pop the link to the Future Generations framework in the chat, and also always happy to chat about it further, because it's great. And then in terms of how we involve or account for the disproportionate impact on socially vulnerable groups, so I've already said, like, for Wales, we need to involve the diversity of the population that will be impacted by a decision, and we need to make sure that represents the diversity of that population. So that's a legal duty, and the Auditor General for Wales needs to consider that, and how public bodies are doing it. More, I think it's about how we have conversations and how we understand what's happening with groups and what our neighbours and our fellow citizens or residents or visitors, how they are impacted by this and what their lived experiences are every day, because I suppose there's just such isolation, and my experience of climate change will be very different to other people's. And so how we do that to then understand that there are people that are so much more vulnerable, and to really make it more tangible and something that we can really grip onto and prioritize in real tangible ways. So that's mine. But
there are more questions. There's one that Juliet De Little says, I'm also wonder what the speakers think might be indicators to show we are adapting well, especially in a world where we know that metrics aren't always delivering what we need to understand. I can yeah.
No,
silent.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not going to probably answer this question other than to say it's really difficult, and I don't think that's something that we've quite cracked yet. In terms of that was one of my questions at the end of my conversation, and something that we're certainly grappling with when we move into this pilot phase is how do you actually know what difference these interventions and policies are making. And I agree with what David said earlier about that shift from a sole focus on outcomes, and certainly a move away from that kind of from a public health perspective, that kind of primary outcome, and it's going to be a range of different outcomes, but also the process. And I think, very much speaking to that systems thinking approach of also like learning as we go along and be able to adapt and learn and share, but also improve things as we go. But I think what we don't want is to be kind of caught in this hiatus that we can't move forward with actions and interventions and policies because we're not sure just yet how exactly we should measure it. It's like, let's move into a phase of let's try several different things and see what works. But interested to hear the thoughts of the other speakers. But I think that this is a really key question that we're grappling with.
Good. Just to chip in, a lot of that resonates. I think one other observation around that, and it relates to a couple of the questions on the side as well. I think one set of indicators is definitely around civic health, both through kind of democratic vehicles and through broader civil society. And I think that's important for the reason that Colleen spoke about, because partly that we make sure that the most vulnerable in society are factored into these decision making in an appropriate way. But I'd almost step back and say more broadly, we also need vehicles that kind of leverage the different parts of British society together. And so I think about something like the ambition loops model that is out in the world that basically talks about any significant change needs to get a good spin wheel going that traverses parts of the governance engine, civil society engine, and the business and finance engine, and not to sort of lean too heavily on any of those. But I think one of the metrics for are we well adapting? I think yes, there is definitely one about the world that we are stepping into and the values that we hold. But I think there's another one are our approaches generating momentum across different parts of that model? And I think that element of a positive feedback loop that traverses the very different kind of building blocks of society is really important. And I think it's one that often gets left behind. And I do, there was the question on the side about who is integrating systems thinking, who is stepping into these spaces. There are parts of the financial and business architecture that won't step into those spaces. There are parts that take a much more long-term view and actually are much more leaning into more custodial relationships to the societies they inhabit. And I think they're really crucial in here, alongside, I think helping governments to triangulate the short-term priorities that they are evaluated against some of the long-term contexts. I think all of these things are complicated, but I think that sense of a healthier civic and democratic space and a positive flywheel or loop around these three contexts, I think these are the ingredients that give the engine and the momentum that allows us to move forward.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And the whole question of measuring adaptation is fraught with difficulties. There are multiple indicators of different things we could use. A lot of it is qualitative rather than quantitative, and it's a way of actually expressing that in a way that allows us to sort of get a sense of adaptation. It's adaptation to the uncertainty is the real problem. So how we do that, I'm just sort of reminded that the sort of the planetary boundary mapping of where we are is quite a good approach, because you sort of divide it up into lots of different segments and you sort of assess where you are on those and get an overall picture. And that sort of could be applied at a national level, but it also could be applied right down at a more community level as well. Each of them would have a very different shape to their ability to assess where they are in terms of adaptation and outline where they need to put in more effort. So I think there's a lot of work in progress on indicators and indices of this, but I also think it's got a very long way to go. Yeah.
I think for every question, there are more questions coming. And this conversation is super interesting, and we are running out of time. We only have 4 minutes. So the last question, what is meant by custodial relationship, please? Could community-owned green energy fall under this heading of example?
Is that directed at me as the one who was using the word custodial? I would welcome other folks to respond on that. I think it would be one category of that for sure. But I think there are other, I think there are other groups, like, for example, large landowners who have agricultural land or for other reasons actually are really important for this future, who have vested interests in the long-term thriving of the country in which they inhabit. And so I think there are many groups, right from kind of commons owned land to sort of like centuries old, like owners of land, that actually have custodial relationships. And they're quite different to folks that have more transactional relationships to land, which is kind of buy it, build it, flog it. Like, so I think anyone who has more of that long term has a role to play. They're really different, and they all have their own sort of strengths and limitations. But I think, yes, it definitely goes to that end of like community owned. But I think it can stretch. I think the scale of adaptation we need is going to require a whole breadth of different relationships there. I'll shut up. Just I'm sure other folks have perception, sort of points of view on that too.
I think that I don't know if we have time for a last question, because it's like 48. I don't want to extend it. But before closing, I just want to thank again all the speakers, Ruth, Colleen, Ian, and David. Thank you for your insights and provocation, and for your engagement and all the questions that you answer, but also you bring to us. I will invite the participants to keep in touch with the work that the speakers are doing, and engage with what they are doing in their own fields. I will also just let everybody know that the recording of the webinar will be available in the website of the MACC Hub, as well as a summary of the discussion. And thank you again, once again, for joining us. And I wish you all a great afternoon. And hopefully we will see each other in the next webinar of the MACC Hub.